Thank you all for joining us on this Monday afternoon, and welcome to Philanthropy Impact's Walk in My Shoes series for professional advisors. My name is Sophia and I'm your moderator for this series and the Director of Membership and Development here at Philanthropy Impact. We are a not-for-profit membership organisation with a mission to increase and improve philanthropy and social investment, and to also encourage impact investing. Our weekly Walk in My Shoes sessions has been designed to spark thoughtful debate and highlight industry trends to support you and your clients in developing their impact and sustainability journeys. If you have any questions about what we do or how we can collaborate, please get in touch with me directly. As always, this is a strictly 30-minute session, but we are taking questions. And so we ask you use the chat function to introduce yourself and have your say, but also pose questions to our panel that way. Please make sure to add panelists and all attendees if you'd like to interact on the chat, and remain respectful to all throughout. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our chair for today's session, our board member and founder of Maanch, Darshita Gillies. And joining Darshita today, we welcome Sriskandarajah, CEO of Oxfam GB, Blythe, founder of Philia International and vice chair of Independent Aid, and Rehse, who is the executive director of Global Greengrants Fund UK. Thank you all for your time and insight today, and I will now hand over to Darshi to make us start. Thank you, Darshi.
Thanks, Sophia. Welcome, everybody. When I received the email to chair a panel on decolonizing aid, being an Indian, anything decolonizing was a very interesting topic to chair, and I jumped at the opportunity. And I'm delighted that we have such a rich panel on board today. And our intention for this call is really to use the next 20-25 minutes we have to dive into this interesting topic and bring some brevity and depth to this topic. I'd love, Danny, for you to kick off this conversation and share with us your perspectives on what does it mean to you, decolonizing aid. Why do you think it's important? And how are you as an international NGO going on about this? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Darshita. It's great to be here. Look, I think it's really important to recognize that, phrases like decolonizing development are relatively new and need to be sort of interrogated and sort of co-created, if you will. For me, a sort of relatively simple way that I find it useful to understand it is to think about the what and the how. For many of us who work in international development or in philanthropy, I think we naturally have the focus on what, how do we deliver better outcomes? How do we serve the people we care about? But I think when you're focusing on the sort of decolonizing idea, then it's important to recognize that the how is as important as the what. So in our case, it's about understanding the fact that we are operating in environments where there are huge asymmetries of power and information. And with money, of course, and resource comes huge amounts of power. And so, making sure we have that laser sharp focus on the what to make sure that we're making a positive impact, but recognizing that as we go along in that project, that we are being as inclusive as possible, we are correcting for those imbalances of power, or, as Oxfam learned in recent years rather painfully, that it's really important to prevent the abuse of power as well in that process. And I mean, as to why we're interested, I think a range of reasons. One is, I think, focusing on the what and the how, I think, makes you a far more powerful, impactful organization or actor in any case. I think the more thoughtful end of philanthropy, the more thoughtful end of development has always been conscious of that need. I think increasingly, as we to go forward, all of us need to think about being far more participatory, far more democratic in the way that we approach our work. Whether that's about making sure that we include the voices of the people we serve or the people we fund, or just being far more bold and ambitious about our sort of role within this sort of ecosystem. That we're living in such a period of flux, not just because of the pandemic, of rising inequality, but also because of all of the technological disruptions. And I think those of us who are interested in a more sort of just, sustainable, equitable world need to lean into some of that. And for me, although it might not sound like it, decolonizing development is in some ways a positive affirmation of our opportunity to use this moment to disrupt, to play, to turn some of those power imbalances on their head. And that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're trying to do here at Oxfam.
Thank you, Danny. A quick question. Do you think that the organizations on the other side are ready for that kind of power?
Yes. In fact, I think many organizations, I used to be Secretary General of Civicus, a global alliance of civil society with members in 180 countries. And I can tell you from 6 years of experience that many actors in the global South have been calling for these fundamental shifts in the civil society landscape for decades. And that, again, one of the reasons why INGOs like us, who are relatively sort of big actors in this ecosystem, need to be conscious of our role. And I'm not saying that every southern grassroots organization is going to be ready to sort of be fully compliant with donor and regulatory expectations in the UK or the United States. We shouldn't go to that extreme, but I think we need to think about how do we build or strengthen a more resilient and diverse set of actors close to the ground wherever we are. And part of that is about being sort of empowering, being emancipatory in what we do, and sort of actively investing, if you will, in those structures, including those organizations who have been calling out for more direct resources, more say on how they spend those resources, and so on.
Thank you, Danny. That's very insightful. I'm going to ask you, Lucy, to share your insights from your experience, especially with an Africa lens, on what's your sense of how ready the leadership capacity is in Africa, and what's your thoughts on this very interesting topic?
I completely agree with Danny. They're ready. I mean, I just want to start by saying I realize the audience for these sessions are people who often work with private donors who work, they give or they invest personally or through their foundations. And I think the key question is around shifting power. It's one of the biggest issues. And some of the work I've done with organizations in Africa has been really about building the power on the ground. My work was funded by donors, but I was not there to tell them what to do. I was there to help them think for themselves. And it's been such a beautiful journey, watching people figure things out for themselves. And quite often I've been surprised, more often than not, because I don't have the answers, they do. And to bring together people from different countries to discuss how to do things and to figure it out for themselves. First of all, I mean, there's a lot of research on the fact that things work better if the people have designed it themselves. It's more sustainable, and also it's easier to argue for money in the future for something that's actually integrated into what's really needed on the ground. Again, to your audience, a lot of these questions are really uncomfortable. In many cases, it's their personal money, but I would urge philanthropists and people who are running foundations to seriously think and ask themselves these uncomfortable questions and go through this very honest self-reflection about what they're really trying to achieve and what their motivations are. And someone along the way used the framework of asking yourself, do you see yourself as a savior, a bridge, or a partner? And it's, if you can get people to the point of understanding that they are in common purpose with their partners on the ground, that's where they can start realizing that shifting power is in their own interest as well. I'll stop there for the moment. It's very worthwhile. And the one thing I would say, just to add to that, is that the leadership is there. And I think it's lazy for people to say they can't find it. And I do hear that frequently.
Thanks, Lucy. The other thing I hear also about Africa in particular is also that there needs to be a lot more investment in building capacity further down the ground. So if there is leadership, probably execution is where the gap is. What are your remarks on that?
That's true. And in many ways, it's about giving people the opportunity to grow. I mean, and another point I want to make is about gender. One of the things I see certainly on the continent of Africa is because a lot of the cultures are quite patriarchal. It's difficult for women to lead for a lot of reasons, but they are great leaders. And I think we have to admire Oxfam and ActionAid, for instance, for some of their gender lens work in prioritizing women for leadership. That's one of the things to think about shifting power, is not looking at the existing power networks, but looking at the people who actually have influence in the communities. And they are often not the people who have the power status. So one of the things we as people having an effect on the ground need to keep in mind are who are the people who don't have a voice in what happens. I really don't want to take much time here because Danny and Eva are the people who know what they're doing.
Thank you.
I'm really a facilitator.
Appreciate those insights nevertheless. Eva, moving on to you, if you could please share your experiences with the listeners here on what you're seeing, and then especially highlighting, what other particular challenges funders face in enabling the decolonization effect, and also challenges perhaps on the recipient side. And if you have time, if you could also dive into all the other challenges around impact measurement and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Sure, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I think this is such an important conversation. And, in the funder space, we've been talking about this for a few years now, and it's great to see INGOs in particular also really taking the lead on this. So I work for Global Greengrants Fund that I appreciate many might not have heard of, but we were actually set up in the early 90s to shift power in philanthropy. And the idea was that we would be a participatory fund where we decentralize decision-making. So we have today a network of about 150 advisors, and they come from the communities that we want to support around the world, and they help us to find them and to support them. And that's with funds, but not only. I think that accompaniment, and Dan kind of spoke to some of the empowerment, is really important within that. So trust, as you can imagine, is a really important value for us. And that kind of goes up and down how we work. We have to trust our advisors that they find the most relevant work. We have to trust our grassroots partners that they know how to use the resources in the most relevant and most efficient ways. We trust our donors that they understand how we work and want to invest in a model like this. And then the other way around as well, right? They trust us, they trust our advisors that it works. So I think it's actually a beautiful example how closely related and how important the value of trust is in this kind of decolonization work, if you want to use that term. And we support today about 1,000 grassroots initiatives per year with these flexible small funds. And in fact, about 70% of them are led by women or focused on women. I totally agree with Lucy, the role of women and a gender lens into this work is crucially important. And impact, you mentioned impact. I think impact really goes much beyond the direct transmission of funds, right? Because there's so much power and impact in trusting people and telling them, we understand and trust your own decision-making abilities. And when you do that, the implications, the improvements in people's lives and in the environment are immense. I mean, wide-ranging from what we've seen over almost 30 years. And I mentioned we're a fund, so we interact in the funding sector, and there this conversation has really, I would say, sort of since 2016, although has really taken off, and a lot of the impulses came from the community philanthropy space. And I think that's really exciting to see how this is now developing out of this very localized conversation into a much broader conversation, and in many ways Shift the Power has become kind of the shorthand or the hashtag for this more democratic, more direct and trust-based giving. I think the COVID situation has really given an opportunity to test what this looks like in practice. And we've seen some amazing shifts in practice and trust-based giving, particularly in the UK context. But there are very specific challenges doing this internationally, one being that you're not as close to the work. So if you give internationally or your clients give internationally, there is just a barrier to how do you build trust. We have this incredible advisory network, Oxfam has their country entities, but it is harder when you're, say, a smaller trust or foundation. So I would say, and you know, maybe we can leave it for the discussion, that we also need to shift our understanding of impact. We need to measure what matters, to steal from a report that recently came out. We need to really shift our due diligence and our understanding of risk. But I would argue that ultimately, when we do that, and we do give directly, and we really rethink our power and our practices, it'll be a more efficient investment, because, and this has also been said, and I don't need to repeat it, you create this ecosystem of responses and not perpetuate those dependencies that already exist and that in many ways have created the problems in the first place. And my final thought, and maybe we'll come to it, is that we actually don't use the decolonizing language, and we weren't set up with that idea in mind. And it's really important to understand where language can help us or hinder this conversation. And when we can come back to that as well.
Thank you, Eva. That was very insightful. We have a question from Chris Marks asking if there are any sites or case studies on how trust foundations who are ahead of the curve have tackled these challenges. Would you have some insights, Eva?
Yeah, I can share a few links in the chat. I mean, I mentioned the Shift the Power work. There was a meeting a couple of years ago now, and we have a manifesto that came out of that. And there's some really great site, which is run by the Global Fund for Community Foundation. So I would point to that as sort of a first start. But we are also co-organizing and have been organizing a group of funders under the Shift the Power banner for a few years now. And if funders are interested, we can share more information on how to get involved there.
I would also say that the Open Society Foundations seem to be doing a lot of really good work in this space. I don't know if they've written up their case studies, but it's quite possible to have a look at their website.
Danny, any resources from your side that you could help?
Well, I think, like Eva said, if you're on Twitter, just put in #ShiftThePower and you'll see about 4 or 5 years of a very dynamic conversation full of resources and challenge, I think. But also, you know, some of this, as I said right at the start, we are all, I don't want to say making it up as we go, but we are inventing this new sort of phase, I think. And there isn't a sort of playbook yet. There will be soon, I hope, as more people take on some of this practice. But in some ways, we're at the vanguard of trying to rethink the role of not just, you know, individual bits about this ecosystem, INGOs or donors or whatever, but really rethink what sort of philanthropy for impact means in the coming decades.
Thank you, Dan. There is a question from John Edwards. John, if you don't mind, I'm going to shrink your question ever so slightly so we can get everyone's input on the same question. If decolonization is about shifting power, do private philanthropy relations with funding partners currently mirror the international NGO local power dynamics? And do philanthropy international relations need to change first? And if so, how?
Lucy, do you want to go?
No, Danny, I think I feel overwhelmed by that question. It's such a big one. And you've dealt with really big questions very articulately.
So I think, John, you're right, because I suspect you know what the answer to that is. Yes, I think there do need to be some of these changes. And look, you know, in some ways, I'm really excited to be part of these conversations because, you know, if you take an organization like Oxfam Great Britain, we ourselves are a donor of sorts. We raise, you know, more than £100 million worth of unrestricted income from our supporters, and have to think about these issues as much as, you know, when we receive money from trusts and foundations or individuals. And I do think that there is a really important shift that needs to happen in across the sort of chain, if you will, or really to rethink what that chain means, because the traditional approach to international development, at least in the last few decades, has been this sort of highly complex system. Some people call it the development industrial complex, that's full of these sort of chains where, you know, it's almost a sort of trickle down approach to resourcing for change. And that has advantages, particularly around assurance and compliance and safe programming, but it can constrain all of us because we end up sort of instrumentalizing others and constraining others the further we don't go down that chain. And so we do need to think about sort of all sorts of relationships. A good example, a live example from the Oxfam experience is, part of our new strategy at Oxfam Great Britain is to work in some of the toughest places on the planet, the fragile, war-torn, climate-ravaged contexts in the world, where international NGOs like us, as Eva and Lucy have said, can add value by being the trusted broker. Because, in this case, it's not just small trusts and foundations, it might be big trusts and foundations, or even donor governments that don't have the wherewithal to be in a Yemen or a Syria or a DRC. But organizations like ours have been there for a while, and we want to be there accompanying our local partners. No longer can we afford simply to see ourselves as this sort of, implementing agency at the end of subcontracting income through this chain. And we need to be part of that decolonizing or empowering process. And so we're working, for example, with a high net worth individual who's giving Oxfam resources so that we can seed community foundations in a couple of countries in the pilot stage that will support women's rights organization close to the ground. Because many of those organizations have been saying for years that they don't have sufficient core resources that build their own institutional strength so that they can speak on their own terms and act on their own terms. And they don't want to be sort of at the end of a very long contracting chain. And so and that's what I'm saying, that's sort of making this up as we go. We are, as at the moment, piloting this new approach where we can bring our sort of know-how and expertise of humanitarian interventions, of long-term development programming, but we're also, through this initiative, seeding the sort of resourcing flows that I hope will strengthen the sort of resilience of women's rights organization close to the ground, not through sort of conditional grants, but through core grants that build institutional strength. And that has involved, as to John's point, a recalibration of not just where we can add value, but the conversation we're having with this philanthropist who's supporting us in this work.
Thank you, Danny. Anything on your side, Eva?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo all of that and to say, I think it's really important to understand ourselves as an ecosystem, right? We have to have all these conversations at the same time, and we need to rethink at all levels. I think there isn't a priority. You start here and then you go there. That's also because of the scale of the problems that we're looking at and the urgency we're facing if we're looking at the climate crisis, for example. So I think understanding it as a true partnership where people are pulling in the same direction rather than sort of a competition between local actors and international actors, for example, really identifying the added value if you're an INGO or if you're a funder, what are you bringing, right? Not only ever seeing people as recipients, but as equals, and equity, I think, is an important value in this. And then the resilience building, I totally agree, should actually be the sort of the concept that guides us through this. And I dropped a link in the chat on a recent report on resilience that we co-authored. And then finally, I think it is pretty clear, and that's where the power lies. Funders can just move their funding, right? It's as simple as that. And then you start, agendas at INGO start shifting, and you are almost forced to collaborate. But I think that's the wrong way to approach it. And I haven't seen funders approach it from that perspective. It has really been much more about equity and, feeling that we're all on the same side of the table, and how do we improve collectively as an ecosystem.
There's a really good example of that with the funders of mine removal. So when the Halo Trust and MAG and other mining organizations decided to work together, they had a much better collective time fundraising and getting action done on the ground. So funders like it when organizations see themselves as part of an ecosystem and work together.
Thanks, Lucy. I think we are learning from several examples that collaboration is key, and especially COVID has shown that. Coming together, we can do more and better and faster and more effective. I have a question for the audience, which is, from your perspective, especially for those of you who engage with philanthropists or with large funds, or even within your organizations, if you're making decisions around philanthropy, what are the kind of resistances that you think might come up in having even a conversation or thought about this? And if you don't mind sharing those questions here, we may not have the time to answer all of them, but it would be good for us, even as Philanthropy Impact, to collect some of those challenges and perhaps have those answered through our future publications.
I think sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Carry on.
Just one thing, I think failures are a really important thing to share here as well. I once had a philanthropy advice client who didn't take my advice to work with an NGO on the ground who understood the territory in one African country. And it was a mess because he tried to set up his own foundation and they didn't do the right things. And I can't share details, but it was really sad because it could have been really wonderful. And it wasn't.
Yeah, thank you. I have a similar experience as a board member of a foundation where we made a grant to someone in India and only later to realize they needed special permissions to receive foreign exchange capital. And so these are obviously like things that can be avoided because time is sometimes of the essence in delivering solutions, and capital being held back is definitely not the way to go about it. I have another beautiful remark from Rick Holland from our audience, which I would love to share with everyone. He says, resilience equals more long-termism, fewer strings, and less risk aversion. And I think these are, I would say, key points that are enablers in this movement. We have 3 more minutes. I have one quick question to all 3 of you. In this year, what could foundations, especially on the Western side or the global North, what is the one thing that they could do to enable this movement of shift in power and more balance?
I've got 2, if I'm allowed, very quickly. I mean, one is you know, we are facing such unprecedented disruption and uncertainty that I think the best way to sort of to deal with it is with unprecedented sort of boldness and ambition. And that's where the, you know, the value add of thoughtful private philanthropy really comes to the fore, where, you know, philanthropists who can think big, who want to take systemic challenges on, who can take risks. And then the other is a you know, coming back to the sort of decolonizing point, there's a very important Australian Aboriginal activist who in the 1970s said, if you came to help me, you're wasting your time. If you come because your liberation is deeply entwined with my liberation, let's talk. It's Lilla Watson. And I think it's that sort of approach at this moment where, you know, even amidst all of this uncertainty of COVID and the sort of insecurity and inequality we're facing, that notion of joint purpose, of solidarity, I think, should be at the heart of all of our response.
Thank you.
Mine would be take risks to trust. It's aligned with what Danny was saying. Be flexible, allow people to make choices that things might change. Allow your beneficiaries to make choices for themselves about what's the best impact, and integrate leadership with lived experience. And don't talk to people as informants, but think of them as people with wisdom and ideas.
And I will add that a bit to steal from Danny, what he said earlier, co-create with us, learn from each other, learn with us as we're on this journey.
Thank you. John, over to you.
Thank you. I was going to ask for final words of wisdom, but it sounds like you've already done that. So that's terrific. Thanks for doing that. Lucy, Eva, Danny, and Darcy, thank you very much for this. Really fascinating. And I'm sorry we only had 30 minutes, but maybe there'll be other opportunities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You as well, Philia.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody. It was super interesting and really just the tip of the iceberg, I imagine. We are back next Monday, so please do come and join us for the Walk in My Shoes. And also this week we have an event on Thursday looking at art, philanthropy in art and social investment in art and the opportunities for funders there. So do join us for that. Thank you very much and have a brilliant week. Bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.